Hi, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Professor Amanda Frost, the author of You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping, From Dred Scott to the Dreamers. She's a professor of law and government at American University. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic. She's also testified before the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Professor Frost, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. I've attended many ceremonies where someone in a powerful position, sometimes a judge, sometimes a mayor, bestows the honor of citizen on dozens of people at once. Flowers are given, pictures are taken, family is there, tears are shed, both by the newest people who get to call themselves American and by witnesses like myself. It's a very emotional experience, an emotional ceremony to watch, and I've seen many of them. But what is it like when the action goes the other way, when the title of citizen is revoked? Believe it or not, citizen stripping, as Amanda Frost calls it, goes back to the Dred Scott decision in 1857. So first of all, Professor, when and how did you realize that the act of revoking citizenship is just as important as understanding as bestowing citizenship?
Yes, so I'm a professor of immigration and citizenship and constitutional law, and I'm supposedly an expert in these topics. But about 4 years ago, long after I entered the field, I began exploring citizenship stripping because I heard a story that really struck me. It was the story of Ethel Mackenzie, and I begin the book with her story. And she was a suffragist. She was born in 1885 in San Francisco, born a U.S. citizen, of course, because everyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a citizen under our Constitution. And then she fought for women's right to vote, and she succeeded. She was one of the instrumental people who helped women gain the right to vote in the United States. But then when she herself went to vote, she was told she couldn't vote, and in fact, that she was no longer a citizen because she'd married a non-citizen. And under a federal law, all U.S. citizen women, whether they were naturalized in a ceremony like you just described watching, or born a U.S. citizen, all those women, and only women, not men, automatically lost their citizenship upon marrying a non-citizen. So that struck me as extraordinary. And then I began looking at citizenship stripping and realized it was far more prevalent than I had ever known and than had been written about. So I decided it deserved a book.
I want to define the term. What does citizen actually mean? And is it in American construction? Did it start with our country? And if not, where? And so answer that first. What does the word citizen actually mean?
Yeah, so good, such a good question, because of course I'm a law professor, so there's a legal meaning, and I'll talk about that in the United States, what it means legally. But I think, as we also all know, it has a sociological meaning, a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of a community as opposed to an outsider or an other. So first, I think the United States really invented the kind of citizenship that we have here today, and I would say is prevalent in most countries in the world, which is the idea that the citizens control the idea of who is a citizen and control their government to some degree in a democracy. And the United States, in its Declaration of Independence, said we are no longer citizens of Great Britain. We can control our citizenship, and we are creating a new citizenship. So that was an extremely important moment in American history and world history.
So did citizenship not matter when there was a king? I mean, if you're a king, you can tell anybody around you to do whatever they want, whatever you want, and the citizenship or not doesn't matter?
Yeah, so they were called citizens, but really what they were was subjects. Here's the important distinction. You couldn't control who you were a subject of. So there was no such thing as saying, I no longer want to be a citizen of England under the control of King George. That was the position of King George, right? And you couldn't say, no, I'm not a citizen of your country and I have gone off and created my own. Or I'm just going to join another country. That was not allowed. And in the United States, the idea was no, citizens must consent to their citizenship, and they have an important role to play in defining citizenship and controlling their government.
And so define citizen, I cut you off there, but define citizen both in a legal sense and then in a social sense, what it means.
Yeah. So just to quickly go through some of this really interesting U.S. history on this. So it started off, we have our U.S. Constitution in 1787. It did not define who was a citizen. I think intentionally in a way, because slavery was the great unresolved issue of our nation. And there was a real question as to whether free blacks were citizens and certainly whether slaves were citizens and would be considered such. But citizenship was required to serve in government. Under the Constitution, you have to be a natural born citizen to be president and a citizen to serve in Congress. But the definition of citizen was very unclear. So that brought us to Dred Scott, where the Supreme Court declared for the first time definitively, they said no black person, slave or free, could ever be a citizen of the United States, could ever have such rights. So of course we fought the Civil War, and that led us to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which gave citizenship to all born on US soil. So the rights of citizenship today, and basically since that amendment, include the right to vote, now for all adults, with a few states who exclude felons, but that's very contested. Otherwise, all adults can vote. The obligation and the right to serve on a jury. And I think there's a few other rights, like the right to serve in certain professions, but the most important right of a citizen is the right to enter and remain in the United States.
And if you leave, in other words, enter, meaning if you leave to go somewhere else, you have absolute right and almost an authority to come back. I just experienced it because we went out of the country for a few days, and I guess because of the position of privilege that I'm in as an American citizen, that at least in the eyes of the immigration officer, it was really just, are you bringing anything back we need to know about? No, well then come on in. It's your right to be here.
Exactly. And especially in an era of very contested immigration policies, in an era of COVID, where people were excluded who were not citizens out of fear of transmitting the disease. Citizenship, I think, has never been more important. And proving citizenship is important. And what's interesting, the last chapter of my book discusses, in addition to having the right to enter if you're a citizen, there's also this further complication is you have to prove your citizenship. And I've run into cases as a lawyer in which people are excluded or deported who are in fact U.S. citizens. They just have to prove it. And the U.S. Immigration Services doesn't believe them. And that's the role of the lawyer, to find that evidence.
What does it mean to us socially when someone says to someone else, I'm a citizen, or I've become a citizen? There are people who hear that and go, look at the work they've done to be here.
Yes. So that's that sociological sense of the term. And they are separate, right? There's this legal designation of citizen. But there are people who are, of course, legally citizens of the United States who would still say they don't feel fully included in our democracy, in our nation. I mean, we could see that most clearly during the Jim Crow era, which followed after Reconstruction failed, when African Americans were clearly citizens. The 14th Amendment made that clear. Supreme Court later had a decision about this. They were citizens. But of course, they lost most of those rights of citizenship through various Jim Crow policies. So rates of voting were very low due to various literacy laws and other laws blocking voting. African Americans didn't serve on juries, had difficulty accessing courts, and were treated in every way like second-class citizens, but barely citizens. So the legal definition of citizen is important, but the sociological definition, the treating you as one of themselves, is a very important aspect as well.
And you argue that by learning about who gets to be called a citizen, we can paint a picture of how this country defines itself. And you say citizen stripping is about casting away the unwanted, and that it has often been used to label those who appear to be un-American. How did you discover that?
Yeah, so that's what really interested me as an immigration and citizenship scholar. There's a lot of focus on the rules of naturalization, the rules that allow an immigrant who comes to the U.S. to eventually become a citizen, or the rules that govern transmission of citizenship. So, for example, if a U.S. citizen has a child abroad, that child inherits citizenship. Or under the 14th Amendment, anyone born in the United States, including children of immigrants, is automatically a citizen. So those laws were all, of course, very important to defining who we are as a nation. And your listeners might be interested to know, until 1952, there were racial barriers to naturalization because the United States was contesting its identity and was not clear that it was going to be something more than just a white nation. That's been the ongoing battle. And I knew that. That's a well-told story. But what I started thinking about as I wrote this book, and the reason I wrote the book, was because I think actually taking away citizenship is even a greater act of identity formation. When the government says to someone like Ethel Mackenzie, that suffragist I spoke about earlier, or Dred and Harriet Scott, the couple who were fighting for their freedom in 1857, when the nation says to them, you are not an American, that's a very important definitional moment and act that is trying to define what it means to be American. And so I wanted to write about that and also about the fights that ensued and the people that fought to help define the country we have today.
Let's talk a little bit about more in the book here. You ground the stories in legal cases as opposed to, I'm going to just throw a few things out, as opposed to stories in newspapers, maybe museum exhibits, maybe family diaries, maybe, and you do interview some people, but the story is really grounded in the legal machinery of how these 9 folks who you profile are either given citizenship or then have their citizenship taken away. Why did you feel that was an important way to tell the story in the legal machinery? And it's a really beautifully written book, but it's just there's legal kind of back and forth that goes on here, and that's what the stories are grounded in. Why?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, well, of course, one reason is probably, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So I'm a professor, so of course, that's partly what interests me. But I will say a few things. One is I did try to tell more than just the story in the courtroom. I will say that court records are enormously rich sources of information for historians. There are moments when people put down what was happening, where they were, what their status is, where they were born, what their lives were like. That comes out in depositions, in transcripts, in testimony, in briefing. So it's sort of a window into a world back in the 1850s and 60s and 70s and 80s. But I really didn't stop there, as you know, from reading the book. And I actually tried to tell the story of these people before and after. And the after is really important too, because as any lawyer will tell you, and I'm a practicing lawyer as well as a law professor, but as anyone will tell you, you can win the victory in court. What happens after is not always so clear and easy. The victory is not the end of the story. So I did follow these people using amazing resources like newspapers.com and immigration archives the government holds in California and Texas, to keep talking about what happened to these people even after they won their Supreme Court cases, how their citizenship remained contested, and how they fought back.
You opened the book and you mentioned her already with Ethel Mackenzie, and I literally couldn't believe what happened to her, because I guess as someone whose citizenship is as secure as anyone's could be, I mean, I'm born here and, at a time when paperwork is firm and where, I've clearly have been bestowed the rights of citizenship in this country. To hear about a story from, I guess it's 1912 or 1913, to hear a story of someone who fought for rights in this country and who earns the right to vote, and then, as you describe, loses her right to vote because she was married to a non-citizen. So that says a lot about gender, right? And about who sort of calls the shots in society. If a woman can lose her right to vote based on who she marries, as if her identity is wrapped up and is dependent on the person who she's chosen to spend her life with. So the question I had about Ethel Mackenzie is just, whose idea was that rule? And how could the Supreme Court have ruled unanimously against her?
Yeah.
But go ahead, Ethel Mackenzie.
Yeah. I just love her story. I love her story because First of all, she herself was wealthy and part of a well-established family. Her father was this wealthy vintner whose wines won prizes in Paris. And she was as secure as you get too, she thought, right?
Yeah.
And then she caught what she called fever, and she fought for women's right to vote. And California women won that right ahead of the 19th Amendment being added to the US Constitution. In fact, that led the way for the nation. And she was really important in that fight. But as you say, she'd married this non-citizen, a really colorful guy named Gordon Mackenzie, who was a Scottish ballad singer and famous for it. I mean, he was in all the papers. So their marriage was a bit of a celebrity event. They're the Kardashians of their day, except I think classier. And then she goes to vote, right? And actually, I have to say, this was an orchestrated media moment. She knew she would be denied.
Right, she went there with media in tow.
Yep, she was really good, really savvy at using the media. And in fact, all these pictures of her in the paper around that time show her holding her new baby. And it says, the baby is a citizen and has the right to vote eventually. And she does not, right? Mother is not a citizen, even though she was the suffragist who fought for that right for all women. So she was really savvy. And she was outraged by this law. And you said, well, why was it enacted? So you actually made this point really well in your question. There was, and the early 20th century was a time of figuring this out. Women had always been treated as having the same identity, legal identity, as their husbands under a doctrine called couverture, which was slowly dying. So, for example, before the 20th century, in the 19th, women would earn wages, but they belonged to their husbands. Or women couldn't sign checks or control their own bank accounts or their own property when they were married. That slowly was dying out. But the idea of this 1907 law was, I think, an intersection of basically sexism and xenophobia. And the idea was women should have the same passport as their husband, their same citizenship as the husband, and it follows the husbands. And I will say at the same time that women automatically lost their citizenship, US citizen women lost it. Men who married non-citizens, those women automatically gained the men's citizenship. So it was in that way, it worked both ways, but of course it was always prioritizing the male citizenship. And there was a hearing on this. And the hearing was in, I think, 1917, before women got the right to vote across the nation in the 19th Amendment. And women testified very movingly. They said, we love our citizenship and we love our country. Why aren't we allowed to keep it? And the male legislators just laughed at them. And you could see there's obviously no oral audio, but there's a written transcript with brackets for laughter.
And where did you find that transcript? What was the source for that?
ProQuest, which is a database that you can get these old congressional records, which is another really rich source. And one of the legislators chided the woman in front of him who had lost her citizenship by marrying a non-citizen. And he said, why can't you marry a good old American boy? He said, you could just see this. The good news, and there is happy news here, is what happened after women get the right to vote. But you mentioned that Supreme Court case, so I'll just mention it. It's from 1915, and Ethel Mackenzie, being a red-blooded American, files a lawsuit and takes it to the Supreme Court, saying, I should have the right to vote. I'm still a citizen. This law is unconstitutional in violation of the 14th Amendment, which gave me citizenship. And the Supreme Court rules against her 9-0. And they said, very similar to those male, they were all men, of course, to the male legislators, they said, if you marry a non-citizen, it has consequences. But there is a happy ending. I don't know if you want me to go into it here.
I do.
Yeah. So what I love about this ending, it shows you the significance of political power and the right to vote. So women across the country got the right to vote in the 19th Amendment added to the US Constitution in 1920. And, of course I knew that fact for a long time. It didn't strike me until I was researching this book, what that meant for members of Congress. Overnight, their constituency doubled. And it was a group of people they'd never had to worry about before.
Yeah.
1917, 1918, they're belittling the women who are protesting this law. By 1921, they're saying, this law is archaic. It's horrible. We've got to take it off the books. And so they did amend the law in 1922, I believe. And a couple of important things. So first, we can see the political power of women making a difference here. And that's significant. But they didn't completely end the law. What they did was amend it so that women who married white men who were foreigners kept their citizenship. But women who married men who were not eligible to naturalize, which at that time meant all Asian men, all men from Arab countries, various other ethnic and racial groups, they kept losing their citizenship, even after the law was amended to keep white women retaining their citizenship who married white men. So, as I said, there is a happy ending. In 1928, a woman named Ruth Bryan Owen got elected to Congress. She was the first woman to represent the South. Very few women in Congress at that time. I think it was 6. And she herself had lost her citizenship by marrying a non-citizen and then regained it, ran for Congress, won. And she was instrumental in ending the law for all women. And I really give her credit. She was white. I give her credit for seeing that the law remained in place for women who were not like her and who married men who were not like her husband. She could see the injustice of that, and she changed it for all women. So I like the end of that story.
And the word white was actually in the books of law.
No, and that's, again, our country is just fascinating. So often we use euphemisms or avoid saying what everyone knows we mean. So, the Constitution doesn't refer to slavery, but it's clearly protected in that document originally until the Reconstruction era. And this law did not refer to white people. It said women who marry men not eligible to naturalize. But who wasn't eligible to naturalize? That law used, originally white, in 1790, the first Naturalization Act was enacted that said only white free men could naturalize, white free people could naturalize. And following that, the law was amended various times, but it continued to exclude, well, really what it did is affirmatively allowed only whites and blacks to naturalize Africans and excluded everybody else. And then slowly over the course of the 20th century, those racial distinctions were removed. In 1943, for the first time, immigrants from China were allowed to naturalize. And the last racial restriction to naturalization was ended in 1952, which is just shockingly late.
The story of this is, what's fascinating about this story is that the story is playing out before our eyes, and we can watch the debate happening live right now. History is very much happening, and that is particularly true when it comes to the 14th Amendment. There are calls by people who have political power right now to end the 14th Amendment guarantee of birthright citizenship. And you tell at least part of the story, a good section of the story, with the story of Ha Moi. I hope I'm saying that right? Ha Moi. First of all, he's a Chinese American, by the way, who lived in the 19th century. But where do the recent calls to repeal birthright citizenship fit into the narrative of the practice of the 14th Amendment since its ratification?
Yes, and so this is, to me, one of the most fascinating stories of U.S. history. Of course, it always is. When you're writing about it, you get this mindset. But I do think birthright citizenship says a lot about America, and the way it's been contested says a lot about American history, including, as you say, up until today. So I'll briefly sketch the background here. And Ha Moi I do talk about in the introduction, but the man who is the central legal figure is a man named Wong Kim Ark. He was born in 1870 in San Francisco. He was the son of 2 Chinese immigrants who were not allowed to naturalize at that time. As I mentioned, there was racial bars to naturalization. But he was born in San Francisco. So he was born a U.S. citizen under the Birthright Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment that says if you're born on U.S. soil, you're a citizen. And he lived in the United States most of his life. But he traveled to China occasionally to visit family. And when he came back from one of those journeys in 1896, he had been visiting a family in China, came back after a few months to the country that he'd been born in, the United States, and he was barred from entering because the US government had been looking for a test case. And their argument was, and it was an extraordinary argument, their argument was that all the children of immigrants, they couldn't make a racial argument because the 14th Amendment was race neutral. So they couldn't say just the children of Chinese immigrants, although it's clearly what they wanted. But the US government, this is the federal government, said, if you're the child of 2 immigrant parents, neither of whom is naturalized, which of course included the children of all Chinese immigrants, you are not a citizen. So they contested birthright citizenship for this group. This amounted to hundreds of thousands of people at the time. It was 1898. And in fact, they put the oral argument off until after the elections because the government's position could have disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of people and prevented some of those people from serving in federal office because if they weren't citizens, they couldn't serve in Congress. So it was a really shocking position the US government took. They argued this before the Supreme Court, and the Solicitor General who made the argument was a man named Holmes Conrad. And I think it should come as no surprise that we look back at the history of Holmes Conrad, and he was a Confederate officer who'd owned slaves. And I think this case, Wonky was an extension of Reconstruction and the battles of Reconstruction and the Civil War. We just had never resolved, I would say even today, not resolved that issue. So Wonky took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was there for over a year pending while the justices decided. It was a closed case, but he won. And that's been so important to our nation's history. And yet, as you pointed out with your question, still even today, this is contested. And Donald Trump, while in office, threatened to end by executive order the automatic birthright citizenship that the children of undocumented immigrants get from being born on U.S. soil. He claimed he could do that. Legally, Wonky tells us he can't in the language of the 14th Amendment. But it would have, he was threatening that, and in just the threat alone destabilized the position of that group of people.
How would the story of Moy, how would that story resonate today? Who is today's Moy?
Well, I would say today's the people who are in that position, that position of being threatened, both legally in terms of losing their citizenship as a matter of law, but also in that sociological sense of being told you don't belong and you're not one of us. It would be the children of undocumented immigrants who, born on U.S. soil, automatic U.S. citizens with all of the rights of citizenship. Clearly, that provision in the Constitution was intended as an anti-caste measure. It was intended to ensure we are all the same. We don't have a group of people living among us who are enslaved or other or second class. We are all equals at birth. That's the point of the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause and many other aspects of that very important amendment, like equal protection.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Undocumented immigrants feel threatened at this moment.
This is a question I've wondered for a long time, and I finally have an occasion to ask it, which is why I love doing this podcast. If birthright citizenship was revoked, let's say it's just wiped off the Constitution, there's an amendment that repeals this part of the 14th Amendment. If birthright citizenship was revoked and someone asked me, Evan Axelbank, for proof of citizenship, what would I show?
Yes. All right. So that is so great. Such a great question, because every time you think about these legal changes, you have to think about how they play out on the ground for the individual. And it's a really good question. So what would you have to show? You'd have to show that your parents were born in the United States, except maybe that's not good enough, because maybe the idea is, well, maybe they were born not citizens if their parents were, in your hypothetical, undocumented immigrants, right?
So I would have to show my birth certificate that shows I was born here, but that means I wouldn't. Birthright citizenship is gone, so suddenly I'm without a home, and it depends on my parents.
Yes, but then you couldn't just show your parents were born here. You'd have to show, and they were the children of legal citizens, and then you'd have to show even further back than that. Like the position the government took in the Wong-Kim case would have unwound the citizenship for generations of basically the entire nation, other than maybe Native Americans, right?
It's basically an unworkable policy.
An unworkable policy. And what we want millions of people living among us. And we already have that, of course, in terms of undocumented immigrants who live in the shadows with no legal rights. And that hurts all of us. And that's a very, it's a very thorny issue. I have no easy answers to the problem of undocumented immigrants. But having 11 million undocumented people in the nation is not a good thing, no matter what you view of immigration, whether you're pro or against, because it means that all of our rights are at risk when you have a group of people who can't report crimes, who are exploited in the workplace, who are paid less, undermining the wages of all. To add to that population would be a terrible policy, right? A terrible injustice, but also a terrible policy.
The book, starts with Dred. Chronologically it starts with Dred Scott. So just explain the story of Dred Scott. A lot of us have heard it, but what are the key things when it comes to being a citizen? And this is someone who basically the court said he can be chased to the point where his citizenship was actually something that could be grabbed onto and used to bring him somewhere else. Yes. Yeah. So Dred Scott, and I'm guessing most of your listeners, I think most graduates of U.S. high schools hear the story of Dred Scott, but at least the story I heard wasn't told in the sort of the full form, of which I tell it in the chapter that starts the book. So first, Dred and Harriet Scott were both slaves, but they were taken and they were married, and they were taken by their owner into free territory. And at the time they started their lawsuit, which went on for more than a decade, but when they started it,
there was a rule very well established, which is once free, always free. And of course, this was a rule established in part to prevent slavery from spreading from the slave states to the free states. And the idea was, if you're a slave owner and you take your slave into a free territory, they are free. So Dred and Harriet Scott filed this lawsuit, and clearly their motivation, and Leah Vanderbilt, a terrific legal historian, has explored this, and I cite her work, was to protect their family. They were terribly afraid of being separated. They had 2 young daughters, and there was a real risk they would be sold apart and separated. And in fact, Dred Scott's first wife had been sold away from him. So he had lived this, imagine the fear as a parent you would feel at the idea of losing your children in this way. So they filed the suit for their freedom. But a threshold question was whether they were citizens of the United States entitled to sue. So as I think most know, they lost their case, and Chief Justice Taney in the Supreme Court, that decision would clearly have led to expanding slavery across the United States, except a few years later, we went to war over that issue and ended slavery for the nation. But that question of citizenship was also a really important aspect of the case, and it's somewhat lost in the high school renditions of it. Because even after we ended slavery in this nation, it wasn't clear whether the African Americans, now 4.5 million people, the majority in several southern states, whether those people would be citizens or not. And of course, if the former slave owners had their way, they would not be citizens, would have no right to vote or exercise any political power. And so that's the fight that ensues for the rest of the book. Who gets to be a citizen and keep their citizenship?
And the fight goes on now, and you tell the story of Wilfredo Garza, who was a Mexican-American who came here, as you document, in 1979. He was doing agriculture work, and he winds up finding this back door into his citizenship, only to have it then questioned again. And so, I mean, you can tell the story of Wilfredo Garza, but the question that I kept thinking about as I was reading about it was, what does this story tell about the way some immigrants are guilty until proven innocent?
Yeah. So he was born in Mexico, but to a U.S. citizen parent. But, I don't think most of us lawyers and non-immigration experts listening to this podcast, know all the rules of citizenship and citizenship transmission. And Wilfredo Garza didn't know it. So he didn't know that because his parent was a U.S. citizen, he also was a U.S. citizen at birth. He had no idea. He comes into the United States. He doesn't come in legally, he thinks. He comes in across the Rio Grande, and he works as a laborer in the United States. And he's deported a couple different times. And no one looks into the question of whether he's a citizen. They're actually U.S. citizenship officials, U.S. immigration officials are supposed to ask some questions like, was your parent a citizen? To figure this out. And clearly they didn't in his case. And he got deported a few times. And it wasn't until he was charged with a crime, the crime of illegal reentry, that he gets a lawyer, because that's the only time you're entitled to a lawyer in the U.S. You're not entitled to a government-paid lawyer when you're an immigrant being deported. But you are entitled to one if you're being charged with a felony. So he gets a lawyer, and for the first time, someone with a little bit of legal knowledge looks at his case and says, wait, this guy's a citizen. The next difficult step was proving it. So the lawyer had to get the documentation. And as you've already mentioned, Evan, it's hard sometimes to prove something that even if you know it's true, but he got the documentation showing his parent was a citizen. Even after his lawyer finds the documentation to demonstrate that Wilfredo Garza is a US citizen, he is not safe. And in fact, he is rounded up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and he is arrested and put in immigration detention. And here he's saying he's a citizen and no one's believing him. And finally, he gets the proper paperwork from the US government, which his lawyer says, carry with you at all times. So of course, I walk down the street, no one ever stops me and questions my citizenship. But I will say for people of color, particularly living near the US border, this is not uncommon. And in fact, one of my students, and I'm nowhere near the border, I'm in Washington, DC. One of my students, who's born a US citizen, but he's of Mexican descent, was stopped for a traffic violation. And then the police officer, not an immigration officer, says, are you a citizen? And show me your passport. Of course, this kid didn't carry his passport around. He had a license. He gave the police he made it clear he knew the law and he knew his rights, and the police let him go. But that's just an example of how some people are viewed as belonging automatically, and others have to prove their membership at every turn.
What was it like for you to watch the Trump administration policy of separating children from their parents at the border, I think with the numbers of people who were ensnared in that policy, we actually don't even know exactly how many. But I would think at some point there was an American citizen, either a parent or a child, probably hundreds of them, who were likely separated from family members. What was it like for you? Emotionally is certainly one question, but I would ask also as a legal scholar, what was it like to watch this happen?
Yeah. So, well, just your point about some American citizens were ensnared in this. I mean, there's a scholar who studied this, Jacqueline Stevens, and there's been a congressional hearing on this. And about 1% of the population in Immigration and Customs Enforcement in detention at any time, about 1% of those people are U.S. citizens who've been picked up by mistake. So, that's shocking, and it can, results in thousands of people. Most of those people aren't deported. They sort it out eventually, but some are deported. There's been a great New Yorker story on one such situation. So going to the family separation policy, I mean, I think it's heartbreaking on a parent to watch the 2-year-old screeching and screaming hysterically as their parents pulled away from them. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. I will say, because I like to be a little uplifting in moments like this, and it's not all grim, the nation responded to that. And there were protests, there was public outcry. And while it didn't end as quickly and as definitively as it shouldn't have started, I will say the Trump administration backed down. And why did they back down? They backed down because people were outraged. And they said, whatever we think about immigration, we don't want to see 2-year-olds pulled apart from their parents. And so I will say, that response heartened me. In terms of the follow-on, of course, we're still figuring it out, still trying to reunite families. And I think any government policy that involves using children as leverage, and that was the goal, to deter immigrants from coming and seeking asylum, which they have a legal right to do, but to deter them by telling them if you do that, you lose custody, maybe never see again your child. To use children as a pawn in that fight is one of the great tragedies and a great moment of shame for this nation.
Do you argue that being a citizen inherently allows you to remain not only in the country, to enter your country, but also to remain with your family? Is that a key right of being a citizen, that family is always family?
Absolutely. I mean, to be a citizen, what the government cannot control or tell us who is or isn't a citizen, or who is or isn't allowed to be in the United States. Imagine if the government could control that, right? I mean, if it's, all the citizens who are Democrats or all the citizens who are Republicans, we're not going to let you back in the country. I mean, that would make a mockery of our democracy.
We're what? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the right to enter and remain in the United States is the key right of citizenship today, but always.
We're watching right now a fascist regime in Russia try to expand its border and essentially declare people to be citizens or not citizens of the country that is being taken over, or at least trying to be taken over right now. And that would be, of course, Ukrainians. You point out that citizen stripping is a technique used by fascist regimes. Why is it such a powerful tool to make this gateway, this entry of who the citizens are and who aren't citizens?
Yeah, and again, that's a reason why I wrote the book, because I was familiar with the idea of citizenship stripping, but I thought of it as something that happened in other countries. So South Africa claimed that all the vast majority of the Black people living in that country were not citizens, which of course is a precursor to taking away their rights. Vichy France denaturalized 15,000 of the French people who were Jewish. And then, of course, that became a precursor to deportations and genocide. The same with Nazi Germany and the Nuremberg laws. And Soviet Russia did this. So we see citizenship manipulated. It's often a precursor to future, not just deprivations of rights, but even detention, deportation, and in the worst cases, genocide. There's a legal scholar, Alexander Bickel, who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was a very powerful quote where he said, "It's always easier to say that someone is a non-citizen than to say that they are a non-person." But the point is that the saying of the non-citizen is the way of trying to other them, make them not one of us, And then the follow-on is the loss of rights. And in the very worst cases, as we've seen in those examples I cited, genocide.
What's so interesting about your argument in the book is that even just being a citizen does not guarantee everything that it seems like on the surface it would be supposed to guarantee. Citizenship does not guarantee the right to vote. It doesn't guarantee the right to health care. It doesn't guarantee the right to a job. But being a non-citizen also doesn't mean you don't have certain constitutional rights. So even non-citizens who are in the United States can still file lawsuits and can still win cases in court about things that were deprived of them. But it makes it confusing, and I'm not even sure I'm explaining it right here as I do. Is the confusion an accidental byproduct, or is it the unstated goal?
Well, so first, I think that point you just made about citizenship should not be the end all be all. And I'll just, it's not the focus of my book, but I think it is very important to acknowledge, which is that, in addition to being citizens, all of us are people, whether we're citizens of the United States or not. And there's plenty of non-citizens, both legal and some undocumented, in the United States. And of course they have rights. Of course imagine if all the green card holders, that is the people who are allowed to remain indefinitely in the United States, imagine if they couldn't file a lawsuit. Would that mean that I could just cheat them, breach a contract without any consequence, hit them with my car and face no penalty in civil court? Of course not. I mean, they have to have the right to access courts. They have to have the right to be protected by our criminal laws that make various criminal actions against them prosecutable. They have to have the right to own property, free speech, freedom of religion. These are rights that attach to people, persons. And if you read the Constitution, it refers to persons more than it refers to citizens. And so that's a really important point. Citizenship should not control access to all rights. But as it is today, citizenship is the source of political power and rights. So it is true that the right to vote, which is a huge complex topic, I know you've had experts on, and I'm sure you will in the future, and I won't get into it much here, except to say that while citizenship does not always guarantee the right to vote, as certain children don't vote, and in some states felons, citizenship and the right to vote are now very closely correlated, to where if you're not a citizen, you can't vote, and citizens over 18 in most states, almost all of us can vote. And that's hugely important to a democracy.
But you still have to register. I mean, it's not you still have to take the extra step.
You do. Yep. You still have to register. You still have to, of course, be able to take the time off work and be able to have your mail-in ballot if that's the only way you can vote be counted, and have it be accessible if you're disabled. I mean, there are many, many ways we can improve that access to the vote, to the ballot, but it does correlate with citizenship. And of course, the Constitution says you can only serve in government, in federal government, if you're a citizen, and states have that as well. So it's really the source of political power in our democracy, is that citizenship status.
But is the confusion over these things, and I'm sure the legal code is gigantic, but is the confusion over these things an accidental byproduct of our political system, or was it the unstated goal?
It's a super interesting question. I'm not sure I will do it justice, although I'm looking more closely at the Reconstruction era. The Reconstruction Congress, that Congress that created the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, created birthright citizenship, ensured equal protection and due process of the law, and provided voting protections. That was called the Second Founding. It really changed our Constitution. And the men in Congress was all men who pushed the creation of those and then helped get them ratified throughout the nation. They didn't want only citizens to be protected, which is why they use the word persons more often than not. So I would say that was a progressive impulse, an impulse of let's include as many people as possible, because these are natural fundamental rights that we're talking about here. Yeah, maybe non-citizens don't get every political source of authority or power that a citizen would get, but they should have the right to speak their minds freely. They should have the right to practice their religion, and they shouldn't be discriminated against or subject to torts or crimes just because they're living among us. And so that was a very important impulse that Congress and the nation had in that era.
I know as the author of this book, probably during your research and during your writing, and then afterwards, you've heard from lots of people who have told you personal stories. And I'll tell you a personal story. I'm not sure how much research you've done on me before doing this, but you probably don't know. The subject of citizen stripping is one that hits me very hard, and is in some ways, when I hear about it carried out in the way I did in your book, it's bone chilling for me. My sister is adopted from Korea and was made a citizen and naturalized. And so when I told the story of what it was like to witness that ceremony, the first one I witnessed was, I would think, my own sister, when she was, oh gosh, I don't remember how old she was, but she came here very, very young, just a few months old. And she, of course, was made a citizen many, many, many years ago. And I started thinking, what if a law was passed that said people who were adopted from maybe a certain set of countries, or just another country, or a certain have a certain ethnic background, were no longer citizens. I don't know how you want to reflect on that, or if you want to reflect on that, but it just made this topic particularly personal for me, because I remember when she was made a citizen, I did have a feeling, I was only a kid, but I did have a feeling, okay, now she's fully one of us. She can never be taken away. But as you point out, laws can be put on the books and laws can be taken off the books.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is a powerful story, and it's a sign of how, we are a nation of immigrants. We're a bit of a schizophrenic nation of immigrants. We don't always embrace that, but we are. And your sister's story is one that I have heard from many different people, some of whom have been afraid or worried for their adopted children. And, I have a couple of responses to that. So first is, the last chapter of my book talks about the denaturalization campaign that the Trump administration very explicitly ramped up during those 4 years in office. This is something Jeff Sessions publicly, a former attorney general, publicly declared that he was going to go after naturalized citizens. And what's scary about that, and Masha Gessen, herself a naturalized citizen who's a New Yorker reporter, said, it puts in jeopardy the status of all of the 20 million naturalized citizens in this nation, people who thought of themselves, as your sister I'm sure has, and I hope still does, as securely an American. Because, and I describe this in the book, the naturalization statutes say that you can be denaturalized for a problem or an error in your naturalization application. Now, of course, if someone lies about their past, so imagine like a former Nazi prison guard who lies about what they did and then comes to the US and gets citizenship by lying, I have no problem with denaturalizing that person. And in fact, that happened maybe 10 or 11 times a year before Trump took office. Very few denaturalizations, and the few that occurred were of really egregious bad actors. But what about the person who there's just some flaw in the paperwork? And the paperwork is complicated. I'm a lawyer, I handle these cases. You can easily have an error in the paperwork. And the Trump administration was going after people like that, as I describe in the book. Now, I don't want to make your sister or everyone listening who's a naturalized citizen nervous, but I will say I went to a naturalization trial, and I watched the government wield this very blunt instrument of questioning not just the target of denaturalization, but that person's brother who was testifying on his behalf. And the brother was also a naturalized citizen. And he was just there to confirm some of his own brother's story. And the government started asking him about his citizenship and how he got it and whether it was, by fraud. And I'm listening to this thinking, they're making it so you don't want to speak up or bring yourself to the attention of the government if you're a naturalized citizen, because then your citizenship is at risk. And that was the point that New Yorker writer Masha Gessen has also made in several pieces she wrote in the New Yorker. How scary that is to have a government that thinks it can take away the citizenship or threaten the citizenship of individuals it doesn't like.
And it threatens the stability of families. I mean, imagine how the three of my mother, my father, and myself would feel if suddenly there was a question about her citizenship. It changes the strength of the family bond, because you don't know what can happen to someone's physical person.
Yep. As I said, the citizenship comes with a right to remain, and someone who is denaturalized or who has a green card and loses it can be deported. I have heard after writing this book from the parents of adopted children, and there are some complicated laws about this. I won't go into them, but the way the law is supposed to work in most cases, if you adopt a child, a foreign-born child, that into an American family, U.S. citizen family, that child is supposed to become automatically a U.S. citizen. The problem is the paperwork that you have to fill out to make that happen. And there have been some really tragic stories of children for whom the paperwork wasn't done, who maybe committed a minor offense when they were teenagers, stupid, and then they're deported and lose the right to live in the country they've always known with the parents they've always been their parents, right?
All right. So we're in the middle right now of, as a country, of watching someone testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that is, of course, Judge Jackson, who is a nominee to the Supreme Court. I want to ask you, I read this and I was blown away by it. You have been called to testify before the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. What is it like? Why were you called there? And give us a window into what the judge right now is feeling as she faces this questioning.
Yeah. Well, of course, I faced nothing like her scrutiny.
and how long were you there for?
Not long.
Not 3 days. Yeah.
Not 3 days. And she was the epitome of grace under pressure. And absolutely, I'm just proud to see her there withstanding with some pretty harsh and I think unjustified questions at times. But unfortunately, that has become our confirmation process. So I had nothing I went through was anything like that. I did testify at Alito's confirmation hearings on an issue involving recusal, which is something I've always felt strongly about and written about, how justices and judges have recusal obligations. And I've testified about other aspects of my scholarship in the past before both the Senate and the House Judiciary Committees. And it's always interesting experiences. Sometimes it seems like it's serves more purpose than others, but it's important for the nation's elected leaders who are not experts in these areas to hear from experts and also get differing opinions. And get a chance to hear the perspective of various different groups. So I've always been delighted to participate in that process when I'm asked.
But what I'm asking is, what is it like to sit there with the U.S. Senate sitting around you and asking questions? Are you more or less nervous than you were for this program?
Nervous might be the wrong word. I want to be on the top of the game. I want to be able to do my job, which is to provide answers to their questions as they think about writing legislation or changing policy. I want to be able to respond if someone's critical of my position and point out why I make the arguments I do and show why whatever critique they have is incorrect. So I'm trying to be on the top of my game. I've done a lot of oral arguments before courts as well, and it's very similar to that. So I'm trained to do it.
And just tell us about, you said you were at Alito's confirmation. Tell us about why you were called and what you testified for. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and by the way, that is a totally different situation because I've now testified a few different times. And often these hearings are pretty sleepy. Not every member of the committee shows up. So you have mostly empty seats in front of you. And then there's not necessarily a lot of audience members. When I testified at Alito's confirmation hearings, I testified not about him or his record, but about the law regarding recusal. That is when a judge or justice should step aside because they've got some sort of conflict or bias involved in the case. And that was something of an issue during his confirmation process. It didn't trip him up, but there was questions. So I was just there as a background expert on recusal. But I will say the scene in that room was unbelievable. I mean, photographers, packed, people lining the hallways and the doorways, standing to listen. It was way more of a media circus than the other times I've testified. And understandably, it's a big decision to confirm a Supreme Court justice. I'm
getting cotton-mouthed just thinking about walking into that room right now. Authors, by the way, two more questions. Sorry. Did a particular senator invite you?
Yes, I think, I'm sorry, that was a long time ago. Say the Democratic leader of and I think, I just don't remember now the name, but might have been Leahy's office.
Okay, so they invited you. And then how long did you testify for?
Oh, so the actual time for your opening remarks are 5 minutes, but I was on a panel of 5 other people and it was like an hour and a half, an hour.
Okay. So authors either love or hate when I ask this question. The question is, what is next? Is there a next project that you're working on? Is there another book that you are researching at this point?
So I love that question.
Okay, there you go.
Author would love that question. I love that question.
Some like to hide it, some with the big media followings, they like to hide it so they can.
Oh yeah, no, I don't have any media following. After this,
you do right here. You do.
I was going to say now after you. So I'm very excited to be starting the research into my next book, which is, and I guess I'll just emphasize that this book, hopefully it reads as a book that's meant for a mainstream audience, a crossover book. It's not.
It does. This was not jargon. No, this was good.
Yeah, it's meant for, and I'm really interested in the stories of the people involved. So I tell the legal story through the narratives of the individuals involved. So my next book is about birthright citizenship. That provision of the 14th Amendment that says if you're born in the US, you're automatically a citizen, which I think is so important to our nation's identity of itself. It's so important as a measure to end caste in this nation. Not that it succeeded, but I think it's gone a long way towards helping us get there, and we're still fighting that fight. So the book is going to be told through the stories of three families: Dred and Harriet Scott, then Thaddeus Stevens, whose name should be better known. He was the great Reconstruction leader, and his housekeeper, but also close friend, a woman named Lydia Hamilton Smith, and her children and his nephews in that household, and how that household sort of came to the conclusion that they together, I think, that they needed to end not just slavery, but to ensure racial equality. And then the final story is the story of Wong Kim Ark, the Chinese American who fought in the Supreme Court for birthright citizenship. So I'll tell those three stories, and through those stories of those families, describe the meaning of birthright citizenship for the nation.
I'm going to extend the invitation now. Will you come on and talk about it with us?
I'm thrilled. I'd be thrilled.
Fantastic. Couple years. That's all right. You got a spot waiting for you.
Thank you.
Professor Amanda Frost, the author of You Are Not American, Citizen Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Check out the book. Check out her Twitter feed, which is at Amanda_Frost1. She also has a website on the American University site. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We will see you next time. Thanks.